Death of an Empire, Imperial Japan, and the Pacific Theater of World War II, Out of the Shadows and Western Influence. The Kanagawa Treaty was a treaty signed between the United States and the Tokugawa shogunate on March 31st, 1854. Signed under threat of military force, it marked the end of Japan's 220-year policy of national seclusion by opening Japanese ports to American ships and establishing an American Council in Japan. Japan underwent rapid modernization during the Meiji Restoration period, beginning in 1868. Japan was determined to catch up with the West to ensure their independence and prosperity as they saw the disastrous and humiliating control that the Western colonial powers had in other Asian nations, so they needed to modernize Japan's political, economic, and military systems. The government invested heavily in modern infrastructure, including railways, telegraph lines, and port facilities, which helped facilitate economic growth. The government also encouraged the adaptation of Western technology and culture and sent scholars and officials abroad to learn from the West. In addition, Japan's geographic position as an island nation, its homogeneous population, and its strong sense of national identity also contributed to the rapid modernization. Japan was able to avoid many of the political and social upheavals that other countries experienced during their own modernization processes, like what occurred in Russia due to this. Japan was able to dominate the Asia Pacific after the First World War as they were allied with the winning Entente powers and gained their support. However, this changed when Japan wanted to expand further, as this came in direct conflict with many of the European colonial powers. The Japanese saw that the Western countries had become rich and powerful from gaining control of markets and natural resources in other countries. Given Japan has virtually no natural resources of its own, and coupled with the Great Depression that affected global trade, they needed to expand into China to continue to modernize, which they did when they invaded in 1937. Gol. In 1936, the Japanese and Germans signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was an anti-communist pact and a de facto alliance against the Soviet Union. Japan also exited the Washington Naval Limitation Treaty at the end of 1936, allowing the Japanese Navy to build some of the largest and heavily armed battleships ever made. By 1938, the Japanese had control over the area in northeast China known as Manchuria and installed a puppet government. They wanted to use this area as a staging ground for their invasion to push further south and deeper into China. The Japanese wanted to create a port near the mouth of the Tumen River to allow transportation of these troops and supplies, but this river was the boundary point between Manchuria and the Soviet Union. To build this port, they needed control of both banks of the river, so they invaded Soviet territory but were ultimately pushed back. Despite these failures, Japan was able to mobilize and conquer further south along China's eastern coast in 1939. Japan faced further logistical issues with transporting troops in newly conquered territory and wanted to build a railroad to alleviate these stresses, but the railroad would come close to Mongolian territory, who were allied with the Soviets and had Red Army troops stationed near the border with Japanese territory. The Japanese attacked the Soviets at a perceived weak point near the river Gol, but were ultimately pushed back into Japanese-controlled lands. On September 15th, the Japanese and Soviets agreed to a ceasefire which would take place the next day, ending hostilities between the two temporarily. These failed border battles with the Soviets were the primary reason why the Japanese never really considered an invasion of the Soviet Union again in the Second World War, and another reason why the Japanese preferred to take the southern road and acquire resources through the Asia Pacific rather than the Russian Far East. Pearl Harbor. After France fell to Germany in 1940, the Japanese, with German consent, invaded and took control of French Indochina on September 22, 1940. To curb continued Japanese aggression in the Pacific, President Roosevelt stopped shipments of American steel and oil to Japan, which was a crippling blow to Japan's military as they relied on imported natural resources to fuel its war machine. Roosevelt hoped that this would force Japan to end its military expansion in East Asia, but this did not occur. After military failures against the Soviets and with its army being bogged down in China, Japan saw another solution to its resource deficiency problem. If it could quickly conquer the Dutch and British colonies in Southeast Asia and gain complete control of the oil, rubber, and other raw materials it needed, then it could defend its interests in the Pacific against the Europeans, who were now busy fighting a major war in Europe against the Germans and Italians. The only force that could stop the Japanese was the American Pacific Fleet, which was conveniently gathered close to Japan at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japan knew that the United States was dominant economically and militarily, but it wasn't afraid of an American attack on its home islands. Japan, however, was worried that the continued support of China by the Americans would continue to drain their already depleted supplies. Knowing that the Americans didn't want to go to war, the military thought that if it would suddenly destroy the U.S. fleet, America would simply give up and allow Japan to consolidate its grip on East Asia. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, killing or wounding almost 3,500 Americans, sinking or significantly damaging 21 ships, destroying 188 aircraft, and damaging another 159. The outcome, however, is not what the Japanese expected, and the United States declares war on December 8, 1941, vowing revenge midway. With the Americans still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, Japan is able to continue to expand into places such as Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand, and New Guinea. The Japanese Imperial Navy decides to gain dominance in the Pacific. They need to take control of Midway so they could launch additional attacks on Pearl Harbor and trap the remaining American Pacific Fleet, as well as capture the Aleutian Islands to prevent American attacks on the Northern Pacific. The Japanese intended this to be a surprise attack, but the Americans were able to break their codes and were aware of the Japanese plans and reinforced the area. Due to the bravery of the American pilots and Japan's inability to deviate from military doctrine and capture the bases on Midway, the Americans won the battle. With a decisive American victory, Japan abandoned its plan of Pacific expansion and would remain on the defensive for the remainder of the war, as they would not be able to overcome the loss of 4 aircraft carriers and over 100 trained pilots. The battle injected American forces with confidence and drained Japanese morale, turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. The Americans strike back. After attacking the United States, Japan captured and fortified strategic islands across the Pacific to make it more challenging for the United States to invade. These highly fortified islands would aim to inflict heavy casualties on the American troops, demoralizing them enough to force the United States into signing a peace treaty. This strategy, however, failed to consider island hopping, in which the American Marines would skip heavily defended islands and capture easier targets, which left these Japanese troops on those fortifications isolated and cut off from supply lines. However, these isolated fortifications also tied up 6 American divisions, which could have been used elsewhere in the Pacific. After Midway, and starting with the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Americans had several victories against Japan in places such as the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Aleutians. The Americans also began to use submarine warfare to disrupt Japanese shipping lanes, creating more supply chain and resource issues. With the vast resources and firepower of the American military, defeat looked inevitable for the Japanese, prompting Emperor Hirohito to say Japan's situation is truly grave on October 23, 1943. The United States continued to push into Japanese territory in 1944, fighting in Guam, the Philippines, and the Mariana Islands, while fighting in China was intense between the Japanese and Chinese. With the pure production and military might of the American forces, Japan could do little to stop their advance, and in March 1945, the Americans started their firebombing campaign of Tokyo, devastating the city's civilian population and industrial capability. Iwo Jima. With the capture of the Mariana Islands, American leaders decided to attack the island of Iwo Jima, as its location could hold emergency landing strips for crippled B-29 bombers that had been bombing the Japanese home islands and a potential staging area for a Japanese invasion. Iwo Jima was also the first time Americans would fight on Japanese soil when they invaded the island on February 19, 1945. The Japanese knew an American victory would be inevitable, but their goal was to make the victory as costly and deadly for the American Marines as possible. The Japanese also built intricate tunnel systems that allowed them to outflank the Americans and recapture positions behind enemy lines. Victory was declared on March 26, but the victory cost the United States 28,000 casualties, with the Japanese losing nearly their entire 22,000 man force. In the end, neither the United States Army or Navy was able to use Iwo Jima as a staging area, but the airfields were rebuilt for emergency landings. Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa took place on April 1, 1945, and was the last major battle of World War II. Okinawa was the last island in the American island hopping strategy before reaching Japan proper. This would also be the last stand for Japan to protect their homeland. If the Americans could capture Okinawa's air bases, they could continue to bomb mainland Japan and launch a successful invasion. However, Okinawa's dense foliage, hills, and trees made it the perfect location to stage a fierce defense. Japan's use of kamikaze attacks was also prevalent during this battle. Due to the misinformation that the Americans took no prisoners, many of the soldiers and citizens of Okinawa fought to the death or threw themselves off the cliffs of the island, resulting in over 110,000 Japanese military casualties, while the civilian casualties might have been as high as 150,000. Nonetheless, the Americans would declare victory on June 22nd. The destroyer of worlds. The human cost of Okinawa made the Americans second guess an invasion of Japan known as Operation Downfall. President Truman, wanting to bring the war to a swift end and knowing over 2 million Japanese soldiers and a civilian population ready to fight to the last man, woman, and child were awaiting the battle weary Americans, decides to drop an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, which was a military and industrial hub, on August 6th. The bomb vaporized people half a mile away from ground zero, bronze statues melted, roof tiles fused together, and the exposed skin of people miles away burned from the intense energy released. An estimated 80,000 people died instantly. The United States warned Japan to surrender. More of these weapons will be used against them, but the Japanese military command estimated that the United States could only have one or two more of these bombs ready and decided to endure the remaining attacks, admitting that there would be more devastation, but the war must go on. Soviet invasion. The Soviets and Americans agree in the Tehran and Yalta conferences that after the Germans were defeated in Europe, the Soviets would also declare war on Japan. The Soviets were also eager to get revenge after past embarrassments of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. After the Americans dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviets invade, sweeping through Manchuria and Korea on August 8th at a rapid rate. Within a week after the invasion, the Soviets controlled most of the Japanese holdings on mainland Asia. The Soviets and Americans agreed to divide Korea at the 30th parallel, even though the Soviets had the ability to take control of the entire peninsula. By the end of the Soviet offensive, they conquered over 1 million miles of land in less than a month. With Japan's hopes of the Soviet Union acting as a third party in negotiating with the Americans all but gone, Japan had no other choice but to surrender. End of an empire. With Hiroshima and Nagasaki devastated, Tokyo in ruins, and with a potential Soviet invasion of the main islands, after seeing the brutality of the Red Army as they swept through Japanese controlled land in Asia, Hirohito announced on August 15, 1945, that Japan will be surrendering to the Americans, though the official surrender ceremony would take place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. The Allied occupation of Japan begins on August 28th, but Emperor Hirohito is still allowed to remain as sovereign so long as he answers to Allied leadership. Though they were once bitter rivals, the United States ended up helping Japan rebuild during the occupation period, which catapulted Japan into immense economic success for the rest of the century and solidified an alliance that helps guarantee security in the Asia Pacific to this day. Thank you.